Hello, everyone. I'm actually surprised that there are so many people here. Like, you're in one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Like, come on, go and do some sightseeing. Like, if my talk is really good, then you can always watch it later on YouTube. If it's not, then you're basically wasting your time. So, I guess I'm stuck with you because no one really got the clue, but yeah. Okay, so I guess that everyone with even a passing familiarity with the model animal rights movement is probably well aware of the fact that it consists of several factions, and one of them being the self-styled abolitionists. And the abolitionists distinguish themselves from the broader animal rights movement by rejecting regulatory approaches to animal liberation and insisting that veganism is basically a moral baseline and should be the primary or even, okay, so the abolitionists distinguish themselves from the broader animal rights movement by insisting that veganism should be the primary or maybe even sole focus of, for animal advocacy. And when the abolitionists try to justify themselves to the animal rights movement in general, they quite often refer to the example of the 19th century American anti-slavery abolitionism. And in this talk, I will have a closer look at the 19th century anti-slavery abolitionism, and we'll try to convince you that the modern abolitionists are not, in fact, like intellectual heirs of the 19th century slavery abolitionists, the original abolitionists. So let's just start with asking the question and answering it: who are the original abolitionists? And I believe that most people nowadays mistakenly regard the abolitionist and anti-slavery movement as being one and the same, where in fact the former was just a small minority within the latter. And abolitionist was someone who agreed with three aims of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was the largest abolitionist organization in the United States. The first aim of the American Anti-Slavery Society was immediate abolition, immediate abandonment of slavery. This position was known as immediatism and was distinguished from gradualism, from people who actually wanted to abolish slavery, but only gradually in the long run. So the first distinction of the abolitionism was this immediatism. The second thing that characterized the abolitionist movement was that this abandonment of slavery should happen with no compensation to the slave owners and without expatriation, that is involuntary emigration of the former slaves. And the third aim was to grant all civil rights to freedmen, so that the abolition of slavery should be followed by the extension of civil rights to all the black community within the United States. And all the objectives of the American Anti-Slavery Society were extremely controversial. But it was mainly the last one that resulted in the abolitionists being branded as fanatics, heretics, instigators, or even race traitors. One man who campaigned for Abraham Lincoln in 1860 complained, and this is a quote, "I have been denounced as impudent, foppish, immature, and worse than all, an abolitionist." And the irony of the statement is that Abraham Lincoln was not, in fact, an abolitionist. In fact, he extended quite a lot of energy to distance himself from the abolitionist movement. So, as you can probably imagine, abolitionism remained a minority position among the US population. At most, no more than 300,000 people in the antebellum America considered themselves to be abolitionists. And the population of the US in 1860 was around 31 million. So this was really, really a tiny movement. If the number 300,000 seems large, then you have to keep in mind that those people were scattered all around the country, or to be more precise, all around the north, and there were very few places in the US where there were like 100 or few hundred abolitionists, and only like 2 or maybe 3 cities where abolitionists were counted in like thousands. And the majority of the abolitionists belonged to the American Anti-Slavery Society. This organization was established in 1833 and disbanded in 1870 after the ratification of the 15th Amendment that secured the right to vote to all freedmen. And the most influential and best known abolitionists include William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, the Green Key sisters, Abby Kelly Foster, Lucretia Mott, Wendell Phillips, Joshua Levitt, Charles Sumner, and many, many others. So why the modern day non-human animal rights abolitionists compare themselves to the 19th century American anti-slavery abolitionists? There are probably many reasons, but I believe that the most important one is that they are really fond of the 2 tactics they closely associate with the 19th century abolitionist movement, namely something called moral suasion. I will explain this term in a minute, and abstention. And here as an example is I would say a representative quote from the most well-known modern-day abolitionist, Gary Francione. And just to make clear, this is not a loaded sample. I could point you to loads of very similar statements made in the abolitionist literature. Many other people, not only Gary Francione, is having such beliefs as the one expressed here in this quote. So I'm not picking him up to ridicule him. It's actually a very common misconception. And I will actually read this quote to you because it is going to be rather important later on. So, Garrison was clear. If you oppose slavery, you stop participating in the institution, period. You emancipate your slave. You reject slavery and you aren't ashamed of your position. You don't try to hide it. You openly and sincerely, but non-violently express your persistent, uncompromising moral opposition to slavery, which is a system of boundless immorality. Similarly, if you believe that animal exploitation is wrong, the solution is not to support happy exploitation. The solution is to go vegan. Be clear about veganism as an unequivocal moral baseline, and to engage in creative, non-violent vegan education to convince the others not to participate in a system of boundless immorality. And as you can see from this quote, Francione and many other modern-day abolitionists seem to be convinced that the 19th century anti-slavery American abolitionists regarded abstention from the products of slave labor as a moral imperative, and that they were convinced that the most effective, or to be more precise, morally appropriate way to end slavery was to convince the slave owners, the slaveholders, to renounce slavery and voluntarily free their slaves. And if that is your understanding of the 19th century abolitionism, then the parallels between the abolition then and now are clear and rather obvious. Veganism is basically a modern-day equivalent of absenting from the use of the product of slavery and shouting at the meat eaters and vegetarians, go vegan, and the word is vegan if you want it. It's just basically an exercise in moral suasion. However, as the title of my talk suggests, I strongly believe that the parallels are false and are based on a very superficial understanding of the original abolitionist movement and the social and political reality in which it emerged. And to convince you that this is indeed the case, I will focus the rest of my talk on the two subjects that I believe are the most relevant, that is on moral suasion and abstention. And the issues are closely connected, but for the sake of clarity, I will explain them and consider them separately. So why the parallels are false? Let's start with the case of moral suasion. So first of all, what was moral suasion? Moral suasion was a tactic first used by the American Anti-Slavery Society in early 1840s to end slavery by appealing to Christian conscience of slaveholders and convincing them that slaveholding was grievous sin and should be immediately abandoned. And it has to be stressed that moral suasion was basically a religious tactic employed by what in essence was a religious movement. The American Anti-Slavery Society came into existence on the wave of the so-called Second Great Awakening. It was a Protestant religious revival that swept the country during the first half of the 19th century. And the people associated with the so-called Second Great Awakening emphasized the power of every individual to renounce sin and encouraged their fellow Christians to strive for personal holiness, to holiness in their personal lives. And almost every single early abolitionist actually came from this social setting. In fact, the American Anti-Slavery Society can be seen as like a secular coalition of Quakers, Baptists, and Congregational revivalists who wanted to use the moral suasion to end slavery. And in practice, this moral suasion was translated into a massive propaganda campaign. For almost 2 years, from around 1835 to 1837, the American Anti-Slavery Society printed from 20 to 50,000 pamphlets per week and mailed them all over the country, but especially in the South. They addressed the pamphlets to slave owners, but also to state and federal government officials, to politicians, to newspaper editors, to ministers and preachers, and so on. By the end of 1835, the abolitionists basically flooded the country with abolitionist propaganda by sending over 1 million of pamphlets, posters, emblems, songbooks, and even anti-slavery readers for small children, as the one you can see on the screen right now. And the campaign required a large amount of resources and involved thousands upon thousands of activists all around the North. The results, however, were very disappointing and very discouraging. While it is certainly true that the abolitionists were able to convince some slave owners to free their slaves, the vast majority of the Southerners reacted to the abolitionist propaganda with extreme hostility. Mobs invaded post offices and burned abolitionist propaganda. President Andrew Jackson, who himself was a slaveholder, asked Congress to censor mail in the southern states, and even though it was obviously unconstitutional, no one really cared. And some of the state legislatures in the South voted for cash bounties for the capture of leading abolitionists. And here on the screen you can see the contemporary depiction of one such event. It is an attack on a post office in Charleston in South Carolina. You can see mob burning abolitionist propaganda, but if you take a closer look at the wall, there is a poster informing that there is a $20,000 bounty for the head of what the co-founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society. But what was probably the worst is the fact that the campaign proved to be counterproductive. It actually hardened the slave owners' commitment to slavery. At the turn of the 19th century, there were many Southerners who believed that slavery was evil, albeit a necessary one. Abolitionist propaganda actually made them change their mind. minds, unfortunately not for the better. The infamous speech that John C. Calhoun gave at the United States Senate, in which he claimed that slavery was a positive good, was in fact a reaction to the abolitionist propaganda. And there were many more such speeches, editorials, pamphlets, or even whole books. And by the early 1840s, slavery was no longer seen in the South as a necessary evil. In fact, it became, to quote another US senator from the South, this time from Mississippi, Albert Galati Brown, a great moral, social, and political blessing. A blessing to the slave and a blessing to the master. And this increasingly hostile reaction to the abolitionist propaganda forced abolitionists to rethink their tactics and to seek alternative paths to reach their goals. And by 1840, the vast majority of them had decided to abandon moral suasion as an outreach tactics and switch their activism towards political campaigning and what is now referred to as revolutionary abolitionism. And this political wing of the abolitionist movement emerged at the end of 1839 with the founding of the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party was something called One Idea Party because it had one single aim, and it was to divorce the federal government from slavery. And the party did not attract much support. Its best electoral outcome amounted to less than 3% of the popular vote. But in 1848, most of the members of the Liberty Party switched their allegiance to the newly formed Free Soil Party, which quickly became a major political force in the North. To simplify a bit, the Free Soil Party later evolved into Republican Party, which was obviously like a major force which actually brought slavery to an end in the US. Other abolitionists were very hostile toward electoral politics. Some of them were actually anarchists or no-government men, as they were known back then, before the term anarchist was even coined. These no-government men are referred to nowadays as the Garrisonians, because William Lloyd Garrison was the most famous proponent most famous representative of this faction of the movement. And the Garrisonians believed that US government had become corrupted to its core by the so-called slave power, and that political campaigning is not only ineffective, but actually immoral. So instead of engaging into like electoral activities, they were campaigning for disunion. The famous slogan was "No union with the slaveholders." In practice, this amounted to fighting against the Fugitive Slave Act, providing help to runaway slaves. They also campaigned against segregation in public transport and schools and for repeal of the discriminatory laws. So it was basically a very early incarnation of the civil rights movement. And of course, I could say there's a lot more to be said about the tactics of the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, but I believe that even this very, very cursory view of the subject should be enough to convince you that the abolitionists, after their initial commitment to moral suasion, rather quickly realized that this tactic is largely ineffective, and consequently they abandoned it and used more institutional approach. So Francione is actually mistaken when he's claiming that moral suasion was this major and sole tactics of the anti-slavery abolitionism movement. Okay, so what about the abstention? Did the 19th century abolitionists really regard it as an unequivocal moral baseline and a true test of one's commitment to the cause, as Francione implies? Well, no, but this should be obvious by now, but I guess it also requires a bit more explanation, and this is on what I will concentrate the rest of the talk. So let's start with what is abstention. Abstention was first used as a tactic by a British abolitionist at the end of the 18th century. The crux of their campaign was boycott of slave-produced sugar and ram from the West Indies, what we now call Caribbean islands. And the goal of the boycott was to put economic pressure on slave-dependent industries and ultimately make the industry and slavery itself unprofitable. As one British abolitionist explained, when there is no longer a market for the productions of slave labor, then and not till then will the slaves be emancipated. The British campaigners did not reach their economic goal. They were not able to influence the long-term price of the slave-growth sugar and rum. But the extremely well-coordinated campaign was instrumental in the funding of a truly mass anti-slavery movement, whose relentless campaigning and especially petitioning actually brought the abolition of slavery in Britain. In the US, the abstention campaign attracted a major interest of the abolitionists in late 1820s, when British Quaker abolitionist Elizabeth Hayrick published her pamphlet called entitled Immediate, Not Gradual Abolition. And in this pamphlet, she argued that the abstinence from the product of slave labor, and this is a quote, was one of the shortest, safest, and most effectual means of getting rid of slavery. And the American abolitionists quickly responded to Hayrick's call by setting a large number of organizations promoting something called free labor and opening free produce shops. Free produce shops were basically shops that sold only products free of slave labor. And eventually the number of these free labor associations reached 36, and a bit more than 50 free produce shops have been opened all around the North. And in one respect, the American abolitionists proved to be actually much more radical than the British who influenced them. The British called just for the boycott of one particular item, sugar or rum. The Americans called for the boycott of all slave produce. This abolitionist initial enthusiasm for abstention and free produce waned rather quickly, however. And there were several reasons why the abstention movement did not attract a major or mass following, even among the people with very, very strong anti-slavery convictions, like abolitionists. First of all, the complete avoidance of the product of slave labor proved to be much more challenging than just boycotting sugar or rum. The supply of free produce was not enough to satisfy even the smallest of demands. The quality of the free produce was usually very low. Prices, on the other hand, were rather high. And for the vast majority of working-class abolitionists and almost every Afro-American, the free produce was just too expensive. And in the end, this exclusive reliance on free produce required so much dedication that only the most ardent and committed abolitionists could maintain it. And the people who did indeed try to master the strength necessary to avoid the slave produce started to gradually concentrate their efforts exclusively on abstinence to the detriment of other anti-slavery activities. And this last phenomena became a major issue of contention between the abstention movement and the broader anti-slavery or abolitionist movement somewhere around early 1840s. The Garrisonians, who initially supported the abstention as a tactic, later started to criticize it rather harshly, realizing that in practice the abstention diverted energy from the anti-slavery struggle by shifting the focus from actual activism to a selfish obsession with personal morality. And if you actually look at the papers and newsletters edited by the abstentionists, you will quickly notice growing focus on personal morality. And this obsession with clean hands actually proved to be a major problem from the owners of free produce shops, because they had to constantly reassure their clients that the products they were selling were actually free of slave labor. And eventually this, let's call it self-righteousness of the abstentionists became unbearable even to the deeply religious abolitionists like Garrison, who strived for personal holiness in his own private life. And by the late 1840s, virtually every major figure within the abolitionist movement had come to oppose abstention. And as a result, abstentionism in the 1850s came to be associated with a very small fraction of the movement, almost exclusively Quakers, whose tactics became known as quietism. Why? Because no one knew that, about the boycott. And according to the estimate done by one expert, the total number of members, if all free produce associations, did not exceed 1,500. And people who regularly purchased products in free produce shops is estimated at around 6,000, and that is also probably a stretch. So in reality, and contrary to what Francione is saying, the abstention movement was very small. It was completely insignificant, and it was at odds with the broader abolitionist or anti-slavery movement, but basically like the current or modern day abolitionist and general animal rights movement. However, and this is, I believe, quite interesting and worth nothing, the fact that the mainstream abolitionists were very critical of abstention doesn't mean that they have no use for the products of free labor. All the factions of the movements, the Garrisonians, the Liberty Party member, the revolutionary black abolitionists, used free produce to raise funds for their activities by organizing anti-slavery fairs. The best attended anti-slavery fairs were held in Boston, Philadelphia, and Rochester. The largest lasted for more than 1 week. The smaller ones were usually held over the weekend or just for 1 day. The first featured free produce, obviously, but also fashionable goods from Europe, as well as the artisan products of local anti-slavery sewing circles. And some of the fairs were really lucrative. For example, the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society raised over $65,000 over the years, and Philadelphia fairs realized more than $32,000. And those funds were essential to the functioning of several large anti-slavery associations in the North. And interestingly, and this is probably somewhat shocking, at least it should be shocking to people who have a very similar view of the abolitionist movement as Francione has. Not all the products that were sold at the anti-slavery fairs were free produce. The abolitionists justified the acts of buying and selling the products of slave labor by their commitment to the slaves' cause. And as William Lloyd Garrison explained during one debate with abstentionists, and this is a quote, "Who but the abolitionist is so well entitled to use the products of slave toil in whose behalf he is laboring?" So if one were to interpret the Garrison's comment in the context of modern debates over veganism, his approach would be much closer to a position known as ethics offset than to Francione veganism as a moral baseline or moral imperative. Just in case, if you're not familiar with the idea of ethics offset, the idea was popularized within the effective altruism movement by Scott Alexander, who is a very, very influential blogger who runs the Slate Start Codex website. And the gist of the idea is that you can offset some of your shortcomings by doing appropriate good deed. Let's say, for example, that you feel a moral obligation to be a vegan, but for some reason you cannot fully commit to veganism. Then you can offset your cheese addiction with a donation towards an animal rights organization. I'm not saying that this is like the best approach, but it's definitely the approach that Garrison was favoring. So I guess this short presentation should be enough for you to prove that Francione is mistaken not only about the moral suasion, but also about the importance of abstention to the anti-slavery American abolitionists. So to wrap this up rather quickly, I will give you some lessons that we can learn from the experiences of the 19th century American abolitionists. And I will just point you to some interesting lessons. I'm currently working on a paper that will discuss these ideas in more detail. The first lesson, which is pretty obvious, so I will not spend much time discussing it, is that you should make sure to study the movements you claim you share affinity with. Okay, and this is the obvious one. But there are some non-obvious lessons that I believe are even more important. The biggest one is do not look for the blueprints in the past. The fact that one tactic or another work for some movement does not necessarily mean that this tactic is universally applicable. And the American anti-slavery movement is actually a very good case in point. Because the Americans very closely followed in the footsteps of the British movement. There were many differences between the two movements, the most important being that the Americans were much more radical, but they also faced much bigger industry. But as far as the tactics goes, they were doing basically the same things. The movement was grassroots. It was based around campaigning. It was based around petitioning. It was based around lecturing, publishing, and stuff like this. But even though the Americans followed the British example, they were not able to replicate the British success. And the reason was that slavery was a much bigger issue in the US than in Britain. So there's not one bulletproof tactic that will surely work in every situation. Okay. Another lesson that is also important and should be rather obvious after this talk: do not become overly attached to one tactic. And again, the American anti-slavery movement is actually a very good example of this. They initially were actually very strongly committed to the moral suasion. That was basically their thing. But after like less than 2 years, they abandoned it as an outreach method because they realized that it is ineffective. And they rethought their strategy and looked at the other movements and eventually came to realization that you have to fight the institutions and not convince individual slave owners that what they are doing is wrong, sinful, and that they should repent. So this, like, the most general lesson would be analyze, revise, learn from other movements, and go forward. Guess that's it. Okay. If you're interested in learning more about the American anti-slavery movement, and not only American, here are some like really good resources on the subject. The first one is a biography of William Lloyd Garrison, but it's also much more than that. It's a very good study of the whole movement. And it's quite possibly the very best biography I have ever read. And I read quite a lot of them because I like reading biographies. The second one is about inner discussions the movement had, and it also should be quite interesting to you because quite a lot of discussion we are currently having within our movement were actually the very same that the abolitionists had like 150 years ago. And you will surely notice very, very similar, lots of similarities. The third one is about the American Civil War, which brought an end to slavery, but it's also about the background of the conflict. And just in case, while the title may suggest that this is some neo-Confederate propaganda, the first half of the title is actually a quotation from Abraham Lincoln himself. So this is like a proper academic, scholarly reference, and you don't have to be worried that you will read something like neo-Confederate. And the last one should be particularly interesting, even though it's not like strongly connected to what I was saying during this lecture. The last one is not actually a book. It's a study that you can download for free from the internet. It's a study done by Sentience Institute, and it's about the British anti-slavery movement. And in particular, it's about the lessons the modern animal rights movement can draw from the British experience. And actually, I believe that the British experience is more relevant, mostly because they were actually successful. And the Americans not. But I decided to focus on the American experience for two reasons. The first one is that the modern day abolitionists, when they refer to the 19th century abolitionists, almost exclusively refer to the American movement. And the second is that this study that you can see on the slide is actually so good that I have nothing to add to it and wouldn't feel comfortable just referring to other people's work. So